Hello everyone. This video is to describe and introduce you to academic tone. This is a term that you probably have, or may have at least, heard someone throw around in college. If you're new to college, it's a term that you're going to hear kind of throughout your college experience. But what actually is academic tone? A lot of times there's some misconceptions about it, and I think there's always the concern about how do you actually do it in your own writing. So the basis is that it's professional, right? So think of the difference maybe between hanging out with your friends and talking with how you would talk with your friends versus maybe how you would speak if you're in a professional work environment, right? The language changes, it shifts, it's not quite so informal. Now, academic tone, while it is more informal, it doesn't mean that it actually is formal, all right? It is more formal, but not necessarily a complete contrast. So how does the whole formal versus informal fit into what academic tone is? Formal is just that it is going to have more sentence structure to it. It's going to use more complex sentences than we typically do when we talk to each other. It's also not going to use as much slang, profanity, etc. In other words, it's more of a standard written English or standard English than many of the varieties that we actually speak. So when you think of how we talk, we often talk informally. Now, this does depend on your audience and purpose, right? We talk about how every writing you do in college, it's to an audience. Sometimes that audience may genuinely be to your instructor. Sometimes it's to an academic audience. In other words, other peers, people at the college, or people who have had college education. What formal does not mean, though, is it doesn't mean using big, fancy words. If you have to look up the meaning of a word to use it, that's not a good sign because your audience may also have to look up that same word. And if you use a whole bunch of those in your writing, that can be a turnoff to a reader. How many of you want to pick something up where you have to look up every other word in a dictionary, right? Or think of it this way. If you include words in your writing that you think your professor might have to look up, you might want to avoid those words because the idea is that the language you use needs to be clear for your reader. And if someone has to go up and look up word after word after word, that's really not being considerate of your audience, all right? So you want to use language your audience can understand, but again, more that type of professional business sounding language, not so much what you'd use hanging out with friends. Now, in order to achieve academic tone, there's a few things you can do. First, pay close attention to your word choice. Next, use concrete, specific words. So, for example, the word thing. Thing is not specific. It can actually refer to anything, right? Whereas if I use the word table or refrigerator, those are both pretty specific. You immediately are going to have some image of your head of a table. Refrigerator is even more specific because there isn't other words that we use to call a refrigerator, right? So think of it in that way. It's words, when we talk about concrete and specific, it's words that don't have a whole bunch of different meanings to them. There's pretty much one way to interpret it. The other thing to consider is to vary your sentence structures. So you don't want to start every sentence with the same phrase. You don't want to use the exact same length of sentence over and over and over. And you also want to make sure that you have some complexity in the structure of your sentences. So again, that it's not just a basic style of sentence. Again, you're going to hear me say this all turn, but you got to consider your audience and purpose, all right? If you are writing an essay and you're writing it to high school students, that's different than maybe writing to your local legislature, right? Different audiences, different views, different values, different beliefs. You would want to have a little bit different tone and word choice for those audiences as well. Now, when we talk about tone, just the word tone in general, literally what that means is just how do you come across to your readers? How do you sound in your writing? Do you sound professional or do you sound maybe a little too unprofessional? All right, if you want to think of it in that way, that sometimes helps. It also helps just to think of the way that we talk about tone when we're speaking. Many of you may have had a parent, grandma, maybe you've said this to your own kids, where you said something like, don't take that tone of voice with me. It's because someone was probably being a little snarky or out of place, right? Well, when you're doing academic tone, you don't want to have a snarky attitude. You don't want to come across as too abrupt or too aggressive or too emotional about something, because that's unprofessional, right? So again, going back to that term professional versus unprofessional, excellent way to think about academic tone. Finally, I want to give you some ideas about what to avoid when you're trying to accomplish this. So those vague and broad words, okay? The word thing, again, great example. Another word that is a really, again, vague word, the word bad, right? If I came back and sent out a message to everyone and I'm like, wow, I'm really disappointed, everyone in our class got bad grades on this first assignment. Well, what does bad mean? Does that mean that everyone failed? Does that mean that everyone maybe didn't get an A? Does it mean that everyone just did less than what was expected? What does that actually mean, right? For some of you, getting an A minus versus an A or an A plus may be a bad grade. For some of you, getting a C is a bad grade, while for other people, you'd be like, yes, I got a C. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. So that word bad is vague. It just is not clear because it changes from person to person. This seems like it should be something that may be obvious, but it isn't always. You do want to avoid slang and profanity when you're using academic tone and in academic writing. It's just unprofessional. And of course, like everything, there is, an exception to a rule here and there, but really just it's a good idea to avoid it. One of the reasons is because of that audience, right? We're talking about always writing to audience. You don't know who in your audience may understand the slang and or who may be offended by profanity. So you always just kind of want to play it safe when it comes to using that type of language. The other thing that you can do to avoid sort of falling into that trap of being non-academic is to not write the way that you speak. When we talk, there's all kinds of things to help you understand. There is our sound of our voice, right? So our actual tone, how it sounds to you. When we are talking, okay, there's also nonverbal hand gestures. I can throw my hands, I can draw pictures, I can go back and explain something, right? If I'm talking to someone and I see that you're not getting it, you're not understanding what I'm saying, I immediately can just backtrack and go over it. When in writing, you only have the words on the page. You don't often get a chance to go back and explain things farther. You often don't get a chance to hear more about how that person feels other than that tone that comes through the words on the paper. So it's just trickier. But there is a distinct difference. I do not talk the way that I write. I write very much in an academic professional tone. I use all kinds of informal language, definitely not grammatically correct most of the time. And that's how we all kind of speak. So it's really important in your head to just start differentiating the way that you speak versus the way that you write. There's all kinds of words that I would use in writing that I don't use when I talk. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that, all right? The last thing that you can avoid is just simple repetitiveness. Anytime a sentence structure gets repeated over and over and over, or a phrase gets repeated over and over and over, that's going to make it seem a little bit more simplistic, therefore a little bit less academic. Okay, so again, just something to watch out for and be aware of. Now, just to start getting an idea about what this sounds like, here is an example. Here's a similar sentence, all right? One's non-academic tone, the other one is academic tone. So the first sentence says, I really like the step-up movies because they are about dancing and fun. There's nothing really wrong with that sentence, all right? It's making a claim, person's explaining why they like that type of movie. But it is non-academic, all right? The phrase really like, that is considered a little bit less academic. The structure of just saying dancing and fun, well, what does this person think is fun about the film? Because what this person thinks is fun may not be what someone else would think of as fun. Some of you may even be thinking, wow, those movies, they are not fun, all right? So that's non-academic. Academic would take it a little bit outside of just being about it'd be more about other people, all right? It doesn't have to be, but it sometimes is easier to sound more academic when you're talking about a larger group and not just yourself. So this one says, and again, this is academic tone, says the step-up movies attract viewers through the mix of contemporary and hip-hop dance styles portrayed in the film, along with the theme of friends overcoming challenges to achieve success. So basically what happened is this person, and these actually were both written by a student. One was their first draft, and then the second was where the sentence eventually ended up in their final draft. The second one goes away from using I, so it talks about viewers instead. And then it defines much farther and in depth what about dancing is something that attracts viewers. And then also, instead of saying fun, this person went back and thought about, well, what did they think was fun about it? What do they think draws in? And they came up with, really, it's not fun, it's the specific theme, right? And so it's more in depth. So you can see that there's a big difference between the two. They sound pretty different, really similar ideas though. So that just gives you kind of a hint of how much tone can kind of affect what you're saying and affect the way that you sound in your writing. We'll continue to work with this throughout the term. This isn't something that's just going to be like a one-time and done, but it is something to start thinking about as we enter this first project. The first project will be a more personal type of writing, but you're still going to want to maintain an academic tone, which is why we're introducing this now.